I joked your mom's prettier than any girl I've ever dated. And his mom just smiled. The transport shuttle hummed as it descended toward the alien diplomatic station orbiting between Earth and the Zentari homeworld, and Jake Morrison sat in the cramped passenger bay trying not to think about how his entire career hung on this one mission. As a junior cultural liaison for the Human Embassy, he had been selected to accompany Ambassador Helen Grant to the first formal dinner with Zentari High Council members, and the pressure was immense because one wrong word could derail decades of careful negotiation between the two species. Jake was 26 years old with brown hair and a nervous habit of adjusting his collar when stressed, and right now, his collar had never been straighter because sitting across from him was Commander Vec, a Zentari military officer, who would be his assigned guide during the visit, and Vec was not what Jake had expected when he thought of aliens. The Zentari looked remarkably human in body structure, but their skin had a faint lavender tint that seemed to shift in the light, and their eyes were larger with vertical pupils that gave them an intense predatory look. And Vec stood nearly 7 feet tall with broad shoulders and a presence that made the shuttle feel even smaller, and his uniform was dark and form-fitting, showing off a physique that spoke of both strength and discipline. What made Jake more nervous was that Vec had barely spoken since they launched, and the silence stretched between them like a void until finally Vec broke it with a deep voice that carried a slight accent. "You are uncomfortable human." Jake blinked and tried to play it cool, but his voice came out higher than intended. "No, I'm fine. Just excited to be here." Vec's eyes narrowed slightly as if analyzing him. "Humans lie poorly and your scent betrays fear." Great, Jake thought. Now he's smelling my anxiety. "Look, I'm just trying not to mess this up," Jake admitted. "And I know how important this mission is for both our people." Vec studied him for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened and the corners of his mouth lifted slightly. "Honesty is valued among my kind. And you may survive this dinner after all. Human Jake." Just Jake is fine. The shuttle docked, and they made their way through the pristine corridors of the diplomatic station where Zentari and human personnel moved with practiced efficiency. And Jake noticed how the Zentari moved with a fluid grace despite their size, and several of them nodded respectfully to Vec as they passed, which told Jake his guide was someone important. They entered a preparation room where Ambassador Grant was already reviewing holographic notes about Zentari customs, and she looked up with her sharp gray eyes and gave Jake an encouraging nod. "Mr. Morrison, good you're here, and Commander Vec. Thank you for escorting him." Vec inclined his head. "And it is my honor, Ambassador." Helen turned back to Jake. "And remember what we discussed, and be respectful, listen more than you speak, and for the love of Earth do not make jokes about their appearance." Jake nodded seriously and understood Ambassador. The dining hall was breathtaking with high ceilings that displayed a projection of the Zentari homeworld and long tables arranged in a semicircle, and Jake took his assigned seat next to Vec, while Ambassador Grant sat at the center table with the High Council, and the room filled with both species mingling carefully. And Jake tried to observe everything while not staring. Dinner began with ceremonial toasts and then courses of food that ranged from familiar to bizarre, and Jake managed to navigate most of it without incident, and Vec occasionally leaned over to explain certain dishes or customs in a low voice that only Jake could hear. And Jake found himself relaxing slightly because Vec seemed less intimidating when he was being helpful. Then came the informal portion of the evening, when guests could move around and socialize, and Jake found himself standing near a viewport looking out at the stars when Vec approached with another Zentari. "This is my parent, Lyra," Vec said, "and I thought you should meet." Jake turned and froze because Lyra was stunning in a way that short-circuited his brain, and she was tall like Vec, but with softer features, and her lavender skin seemed to glow in the ambient light, and her eyes were the color of amethyst, and her long silver hair was braided intricately down her back, and she wore elegant robes that spoke of high status, and when she smiled at Jake it was warm and genuine. Lyra extended her hand in the human custom. "And it is a pleasure to meet you. Jake Morrison and my offspring speaks highly of your honesty." Jake shook her hand and tried to remember how words worked. "The pleasure is mine, and Vec has been a great guide." They talked for several minutes about Earth and Zentari culture, and Lyra asked thoughtful questions about human art and music. And Jake found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation and forgetting that this was a diplomatic event. And at some point Vec excused himself to speak with other officers, and Jake was left alone with Lirache gestured to the viewport. "And what do you think of the view?" "It's incredible," Jake said honestly, "and better than anything we have back home." Lyra tilted her head. "And you are young to be in such an important position." Jake laughed nervously and, "Yeah, I guess I got lucky, and they needed someone who could relate to the younger generation and bridge cultural gaps." "You are nervous," she observed. Jake sighed. "And is it that obvious? Your scent?" she said gently. "And it is a Zentari sense, and we can detect emotional states through pheromones but do not worry. And it is endearing." Before Jake could process that, Vec returned and looked between them. "Parent, I hope you are not overwhelming our guest Lyra." Smiled and not at all. "And Jake is delightful." Jake felt his face heating up, and without thinking he said what? His brain had been screaming for the past 10 minutes. "You know, Vec, I gotta say, and your mom's prettier than any girl I've ever dated." The words hung in the air, and Jake immediately realized what he had just said at a formal diplomatic dinner to an alien military commander's parent, and his heart stopped, and he waited for Vec to either challenge him to combat or throw him out an airlock. But instead Lyra laughed, and it was a musical sound that drew a few glances from nearby guests, and Vec's expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been amusement. He touched Jake's arm lightly, and that is quite a compliment. Young human Vec crossed his arms, but there was no anger in his posture. Bold words, human Jake wanted to dissolve into the floor, but Lyra seemed genuinely pleased, and over the next hour she stayed near Jake, asking more questions and sharing stories about Zentari history. And Jake forgot to be nervous and just talked like he was making a friend and not conducting diplomacy. And Vec watched with what Jake was starting to recognize as subtle approval as the evening wound down. Ambassador Grant approached Jake with a knowing look. "Mr. Morrison, it seems you've made quite an impression." Jake glanced at Lyra, who was speaking with another council member. "I hope that's a good thing." Helen smiled, and Commander Vec's parent is one of the most respected scholars on the Zentari homeworld. "And if she likes you, then you've just made my job significantly easier." The return shuttle ride was quiet again, but this time it was comfortable, and Vec finally spoke. "My parent enjoyed meeting you." Jake looked over. "And she's amazing, and I hope I didn't offend you with what I said." Vec was silent for a moment, and then he said something that surprised Jake. "Among my people, and honesty about attraction is considered honorable, and my parent has been alone since my other parent passed years ago." And she smiled more tonight than I have seen in some time. Jake didn't know what to say to that. When they docked at the human embassy station, Vec stopped Jake before he could leave. "There will be more diplomatic events, human Jake, and I suspect my parent would welcome your presence at them." Jake felt something warm in his chest like that. Over the following weeks, Jake found himself assigned to more cultural exchange programs, and always with Vec as his guide, and always with opportunities to see Lyra. And she taught him Zentari poetry, and he shared human music with her, and they walked through botanical gardens on the station where plants from both worlds grew side by side, and slowly, carefully, something grew between them that transcended species and politics. Ambassador Grant noticed and approved because sometimes diplomacy happened in meeting rooms, and sometimes it happened in quiet conversations between two people who saw past differences to find connection. And Jake learned that humanity wasn't special because they were tough or clever, but because they were willing to be vulnerable and to see beauty in the unknown, and to say exactly what they felt even when it was terrifying, and sometimes that was enough to change everything.